Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've talked about the circular flow, and hopefully it helps us to visualize an economy in a broader sense, including the different parts of that puzzle and how they interact with each other, we can talk about GDP. This is, as I've said before, one of the basic measurements that economists use to judge economic health for a country, and GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. But economists study two major macroeconomic topics that have to do with real GDP, which factors out the impact that prices, inflation typically have on that figure, and that's economic growth and business cycles. So we're going to deal with both of those things here. GDP is also known as nominal GDP, and so as you've learned before with the use of that word, nominal just means the number on face value. But we have to factor out the impact of prices, of course, to be able to compare apples to apples, just like we did with nominal and real income. There are a cluster of different terms that use both nominal and real as prefixes in this class. We've talked already about nominal and real incomes. We're going to be talking about nominal and real GDP. Later on, we're going to be talking about nominal and real interest rates. But it's very important that you go to this link right now and pay close attention to all the information in it. It's a very lengthy PowerPoint, it's a very detailed PowerPoint, but in some respects, especially through the use of video, it's going to do a better job than I can of explaining the different concepts regarding GDP and real GDP, as well as some other concepts included in this section of measurement that are crucial for you moving forward. So pause the video, do that now, and then come back. Okay, welcome back. So, as the PowerPoint lays out for you, GDP, Gross Domestic Product, is defined as the total market value of all the final goods and services produced in a country in a year. And as you've just seen, each of these words or phrases is very specific in its use for how we define what is GDP. So let's continue with our discussion, and I know that that PowerPoint was very lengthy. Hopefully you took notes if you felt you needed to on the information in the PowerPoint, because you're going to be expected to know it going forward. But there are three different ways of computing GDP. Economists use these different approaches to show it from different perspectives, but theoretically at least, they should come to the same figure. The expenditure approach is the one that's used most frequently, and so that's listed here. The expenditure approach is C plus I plus G plus NX. Adding those segments of a society and its economic activity together is one way to calculate GDP. Now, what do they stand for? C stands for consumption, I stands for investment, G stands for government purchases or government expenditures, and then NX is net exports, which is the value of exports minus imports. As I put here, remember the circular flow. Let's go back to the circular flow that we talked about previously for just a minute. Hopefully this is going to make sense to you now that you have the circular flow as a tool for you. But this part of the economy is the C part of the expenditures approach. So take the value of all the money spent by consumers, this is consumption, plus all the money spent by firms or companies, this is the I, we call it investment. Investment means something different in this class than it does outside of this class. Outside of this class, typically when people talk about investing or investment, they're talking about putting money in the stock market perhaps, or putting their money someplace that they hope it will grow for retirement or for a purchase later on. That's not the way that we mean big I investment in this class. In this class, it refers to entrepreneurs, businesses, acquiring more factors or resources, buying more land, buying factories, buying more equipment. That is business investment, capital investment. So that's the I in the C plus the I plus the G plus the NX. The G, of course, is the government. And here is where we find net exports. Exports minus imports gives us that figure. So let's go back down to the expenditures approach. And keeping that picture in the back of your mind, the circular flow, hopefully it helps you to understand that economists talk about those four different sectors of the economy: the household sector, the business sector, the government sector, and we call it the foreign sector, where trade takes place between countries. And we look at the money that's being spent, the expenditures in each of those segments, to calculate GDP using this formula. So you could be given a question with some actual figures, and that question will be saying, please calculate GDP using the expenditures approach. And if it says consumption is X amount, investment is X amount, government purchases is X amount, net exports is X amount, you add them all together, very simply, that would equal GDP using the expenditures approach. But it might not quite be that easy. It might list some figures that are subsets, that are components of these different categories. For instance, durable goods and non-durable goods and services. These are the three things, if you stop and think about it, that consumption can entail. Right? People, households, will buy goods that last, goods that don't. They also buy services. Let's say legal fees, for instance, or car washing services. These aren't products, these are services. With an investment, companies, firms can spend money on fixed investment as well as inventory investment. When we talk about new capital goods, examples of these are, let's say, blenders for a company that sells fruit smoothies, or let's say a grinding machine for a coffee company. Government purchases are done at the federal, state, and local levels. Net exports, we've already talked about. So understand that you could be given a huge list of figures, some of which have nothing to do with calculating GDP, some of which will be connected to one of the larger categories, or they might be components of one of the larger categories, and you have to sift through that stuff and then add them up. Here are some actual figures from recent years that have to do with the different components of GDP in billions of dollars for the United States. You have consumption here, and as it says, there's the C. The I, investment spending by businesses, government purchases, and then down here you can find net exports. Here's some more information you might find interesting. Investment spending, consumer spending, and then real GDP in the Great Depression. As you can see, consumer spending dips, predictably. But the biggest area of impact was in the business sector, which of course is interwoven with consumers and households. If business investment is way down, companies are going out of business, companies are cutting way back, perhaps eliminating their investment spending, and that's going to have an impact on the workers. And consequently, we saw a very high unemployment rate, as I'm sure you already know, during the Great Depression. A little bit more about net exports. Here are some figures going back to just after the Great Depression, or excuse me, just after World War II, up to a couple of years ago, that have to do with net exports. You're probably familiar with the fact that we import a heck of a lot more than we export. So we have a negative, a significant negative number when it comes to net exports as a country. But it wasn't always like that. Now, the second way of calculating GDP is known as the income approach. And this is kind of the flip side, the mirror side of the expenditure approach. Instead of C plus I plus G plus NX, we use W plus P plus I plus R. W stands for wages, P stands for profits, I stands for interest, and R is for rents. So whereas with the expenditure approach, we were looking at all the different ways that money can be spent on the goods and services we produce as a country, this is all the money that gets made from the sale of those goods and services. This is also known as national income. So usually in this class in economics, if we're talking about computing the national income for a certain country, it's this approach that we're using. So more specifically, if we're looking at W plus P plus I plus R as components of national income found here in this diagram, what does that mean specifically? Well, wages, of course, are refer to the compensation that employees make. It doesn't necessarily have to be purely wage-based. It includes salaries as well. But how employees, laborers are paid they all fit into this category. The P in W plus P plus I plus R refers to profits, and there are more than one different there's more than one way of constructing a company that makes profit. We could have proprietors. If you took business economics, we refer to this as sole proprietors, mom and pop businesses, or typically smaller companies that are owned and run by one person, so their income, their profits, as well as corporate profits. So both of these boxes combined go together to make the P of the equation. Rental income is another way to make money, as well as net interest. Now, all of those components in the income approach go to this box. What's not included in your equation, though, is all of the adjustments that have to be made. So once we make that calculation, W plus P plus I plus R, we also subtract income earned from the rest of the world, we add income earned by the rest of the world, and then add 3 more boxes to get our final number for GDP. Speaking of national income, if you want to compare ourselves briefly to other countries, this is an interesting diagram you want to take a look at. Another way to calculate GDP is using the value-added approach. You don't need to know how to do that. Only the 2 other approaches are situations where you're going to have to use the formulas, memorize the formulas, and know how to use them properly. But you do need to know the name of a 3rd approach, the value-added approach. But these different methods should equal the same number, right? I mean, for example, the money spent on the stuff we produce, the C plus I plus G plus NX, should equal the money made on it, the W plus the P plus the I plus the R. I hope this makes sense to you. There are some other ways to measure national income, and they're listed here. But one of the really important terms that I want you to kind of file on your mental computer for later is disposable income, which equals personal income minus personal taxes. I want you to know all of these definitions, but that one in particular is going to come back into our discussion when we talk about fiscal policy and the prevailing economic theories that look at how we can try to manage an economy to try to make it as healthful for as many citizens as possible. Now I want you to click on this link and look at some actual real numbers for U.S. nominal GDP, and then pause this and come back when you're done. Now we want to talk briefly about the difference between GDP and GNP. Sometimes these terms are confused. GDP measures the production of goods and services in the physical area of the country that we're discussing, no matter who produces those goods and services. But GNP measures the production of goods and services by the citizens of a country, no matter where in the world they reside. So GDP is geography-based, GNP is citizenship-based. Now let's look at some actual figures for US GNP. Click on this link, pause the video, and then come back. Now, is GDP a measure of happiness or well-being? GDP figures are useful for obtaining an estimate of the productive capabilities of an economy, but they don't necessarily measure happiness or well-being. Just because we're producing all kinds of goods and services doesn't mean that, people are, even just in an economic sense, provided for. There might be some people, in the case of the United States, particularly the top 1%, that are living the high life. They've got a very lavish lifestyle, but the unemployment rate could still be relatively high. That being said, of course, money isn't going to make you happy. It's important as a starting point for financial and material well-being, but beyond our basic needs, most people would agree that a large figure for GDP, of course, is not going to equal well-being. It's just, in some respects, an important but rudimentary way of measuring economic well-being. One thing that doesn't get talked about a whole lot when people look at the growth of an economy, how big an economy is that GDP is not adjusted for bads. Some economists argue that GDP overstates our overall economic welfare because it doesn't take a look at the negative externalities that come with some of our productive activities. What about GNH? Have you ever heard of this? Gross National Happiness? This isn't a joke. There's actually a country that over a couple of years went through an extensive process of redefining their national health. because they recognize the weaknesses and the shortcomings of GDP. And they ended up coming up with a term known as gross national happiness. I want you to go and click on this link now. That'll give you the speech from the King of Bhutan about their process and their pride in not just defining, but coming up with ways of measuring how well they're doing with this mode of measuring well-being in Bhutan, gross national happiness. Do that now. Feel free to click on some of the links that you find on the site and then come back. You can pause this video now. Now, up until this point, we've only been talking about nominal GDP, but really, just like with nominal income, a more realistic way of looking at how productive our economy is through the use of real figures, in this case, real GDP. So to gauge the health of an economy, economists want to know, whether GDP is increasing not just because prices have increased, but because, in a true sense, our productive capability and perhaps the demand for our products and services is increasing. Here's a difference in figures that you can see from a couple of chosen years between nominal and real GDP. If you were just to look at the figures in this column, you'd say, well, it looks like we're growing pretty steadily. But if you look after the conversion at what real GDP was, not quite as heartening. So how do you compute real GDP? Very basic way. What you do is you factor out the impact of inflation using this equation. Real GDP equals the base year prices times the current year quantities. Once you do that, what does it mean if real GDP is higher in one year than another year? Well, real GDP rises only if output rises. Now you know that if the figure is going up, it's not because prices are going up, it's not because of inflation, and you can take more heart in growth after it's been converted to real GDP and factored out prices. Let's take a look now finally at some US figures for real GDP over the years. So click on this link, pause the video, and come back. We can even take it a step further and calculate real GDP per capita, which is real GDP per citizen in a country. And there's all kinds of interesting information out there, not just about individual countries, but comparing countries. So here's real GDP per capita going back about 100 years, comparing the United States, China, and India. Here's the United States real GDP per capita as we can compare it from 1908 to 2008. Here's growth in average real GDP per capita per year. And so these aren't static figures that look at one year based on other years, but it looks at acceleration or deceleration of growth and compares China, India, and the other countries, of course, that are listed. You might also find this interesting. This is a look at real GDP per worker, and of course this illustrates how our productivity has grown dramatically over the last several years. So to conclude and to kind of zoom back and take an even wider view of the impact and the significance of GDP, we can look over the course of several years and see what patterns emerge. Specifically, where growth is going and whether or not our economy is growing or shrinking at one point in time, and how that relates to what we call a business cycle. Economic growth is the annual economic growth that has occurred if real GDP in one year is higher than real GDP in a previous year, and we experience over the course of time typically ups and downs in our economy, which we call business cycle, that relate to whether real GDP is increasing, staying the same, or decreasing during any one particular year. Typically a business cycle is 5 to 7 years, and it looks something like this. This is an oversimplification, of course, but if real GDP is going up over time from year to year or quarter to quarter, because that's typically how we look at a business cycle, then that's a period of expansion, unless we were just coming out of a low point, in which case that would be recovery initially, shown here, and then eventually expansion beyond a previous high water mark for ourselves. If an economy is contracting, then of course real GDP is declining. And if real GDP declines for 2 quarters or more consecutively, that is the very traditional, simplistic way of defining a recession. We're going to come back to that in our next unit, where we look at recessions, how to represent recessions using an aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, and that what, of course, we can do to try to address those situations when they occur. The high point before a downturn is known as a peak. And as I said, 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP is the traditional and simple definition of a recession, but more and more economists have evolved over recent years to have a more nuanced and comprehensive way of defining a recession. The National Board of Economic Research, the National Bureau of Economic Research, has a little different definition and says that a recession is a significant and widespread decline lasting more than a few months in more than one area. So we try to be comprehensive more increasingly with time in terms of how we throw this term recession around, but we'll come back to that later. Before we leave, since we've been doing all this measuring with regards to inflation, unemployment, GDP, real GDP, let's finish on one more measurement note by clicking on this link and seeing how we measure up to other economies across the globe. Be sure once you click on the link to go to the Economy tab and then go in there and dig in.